To start with, I was never interested in this woman, so I didn't want to get married. But my mother insisted. Now that she's gone, I see no need for a wife. Paul, who hurled such insults at me, his wife, returned from a business trip one day. A photo fell out of Paul's wallet. It showed him, a woman around 30 years old, and a little boy. All looking happy together, almost like a family photo. Tucked behind this photo was a small, folded piece of paper. It was a divorce papers, already filled out with Paul's name. Meaning he wanted a divorce from me, possibly to remarry this woman. I decided to consult Tony and his wife, our relatives, about what to do next. They suggested a plan, and while Paul was away for a week, I quickly submitted the divorce application and carried out the plan Jennifer had thought of. Now, what reaction would Paul have upon returning to a drastically changed home? I am Wendy Morrison, a 45-year-old stay-at-home wife. I married into a good family more than 20 years ago and have no children. The reason is that Paul, an only child born to his parents in their later years, dislikes children and wants to be the center of attention. Despite this, from what I have seen, both of his parents are good people and never spoiled Paul. It's just that Paul grew up to be a person with a strong desire for exclusive attention. We met through an arranged marriage. At our first meeting, he seemed uninterested in women. Does he really want to get married? Watching Paul, I wondered if he was truly interested in marriage, as our match seemed more formal than most of its time, making me hesitant. However, my mother-in-law had known my mother for years, and I had met her several times as a child. She was kind and gentle, genuinely fond of me. Holding my hand, she gently said, "Wendy, I'm sure you will make Paul happy." Moved by her words, I decided to marry Paul, thinking he must be a good person if raised by such a kind mother. After marriage, we started living with Paul's parents. However, 2 years later, my father-in-law passed away at a relatively young age, and my mother-in-law required care due to a sudden illness. With Paul busy running the company, I took on the primary responsibility for her care with the help of a helper. 20 years passed, and despite our devoted care, my mother-in-law passed away quietly. Losing her left me devastated. However, Paul, her own son, showed no sign of sadness. Instead, he seemed to relish having the house under his control. Paul had always been quiet at home. Since his father's death, he worked late nights as the company president and rarely engaged with the family, leaving important household decisions to me. But I didn't mind. I had been told by his mother that Paul is taciturn and not much for conversation. But he's not a bad person. For 22 years, the lack of conversation between us was just how things were. But since his mother's passing, Paul began to treat me more harshly. He even started yelling at me for things he used to do himself. "Hey, I'm going to take a bath now. Why haven't you prepared my change of clothes?" "Huh? But you always do it yourself." "What do you mean, huh?" "As my wife, it's only natural that you take care of your husband, while I am a homemaker and may take care of such tasks." I had never been asked to do such menial chores before. Surprised by his sudden change, I compiled without argument, "Right. Sorry." I hurriedly prepared Paul's change of clothes. Perhaps he had refrained from saying anything before because I was taking care of his parents? It's possible he couldn't act superior in front of his parents. I was merely puzzled by Paul's sudden change in behavior. Being home all the time, I didn't have many friends I could talk to about anything. The only person I could consult was Jennifer, who often visited our house during weekdays. Jennifer is the wife of Tony, Paul's cousin. Tony's father is the younger brother of Paul's father, but had children earlier, making Tony 5 years older than Paul at 50. Jennifer, Tony's wife is also older than me at 48 and has always been a reliable source of advice for me. Today, while our husbands were at work, Jennifer came over to visit. She looked concerned when she saw me at the entrance. "Wendy, what's wrong? You look a bit pale." Surprised by her observation, I touched my cheek and widened my eyes. "Do I? I hadn't noticed. Have you been going through something rough recently? Feel free to talk to me about it." Indeed, I had been feeling stressed with Paul lately. I shared with Jennifer how Paul had changed dramatically after his mother's death. I ended up venting more than I intended, but Jennifer listened quietly. "I'm sorry for complaining so much. I haven't been able to talk to anyone about this until now." "That's okay. It must be hard for you, seeing Paul, who used to be so caring, suddenly becoming irritable." Jennifer pondered for a moment. Her husband, Tony, is the executive vice president of Paul's company and often talks about work at home. She was probably recalling what Tony had told her about Paul at work. She seemed to have an idea as she looked in my direction. "Paul seems, I don't know, like he wants to be in charge? From what I've heard, he acts that way at the company." Her words were a revelation to me. "Really? Paul doesn't seem like that at home, so I never noticed. What does it mean for someone to want to be in charge?" Paul always seemed to be quietly reading the newspaper at home, so I had never considered what other sides he might have. Jennifer smiled faintly and said, "I have a friend who lived with her in-laws, and it's common for husbands to push the responsibility of their parents onto their wives and act meekly at home. But after the parents pass away, they suddenly start acting all high and mighty. It's definitely something to watch out for." That made sense. Paul was exactly like that now. "Thank you, Jennifer. I'm glad I talked to you. I'll keep this in mind when dealing with Paul from now on." "Sure. Let me know if anything happens, okay?" Talking to Jennifer made me feel much better. That night, I was cheerfully humming while doing the housework. When Paul came home and saw me, he looked puzzled. "Why are you looking so carefree and humming? You seem too pleased with yourself. Welcome home." Perhaps my cheerful response displeased him, as Paul frowned even more. Was he really so upset to see me in a good mood? Curious, I gently asked him about it. "You seem to be in a bad mood. Did something happen?" "Nothing in particular. I just get irritated seeing you just doing housework and looking carefree." "Why is that?" I couldn't understand what Paul was talking about. Could it be that he disapproves of me doing housework as a homemaker for these 22 years? As I pondered, I was speechless to hear Paul mutter something audibly enough for me to hear. "No kids and no more need for care. Useless." It seems Paul thinks I'm taking it easy now that I'm freed from caring for his mother. And yet, we don't have children because he didn't want them. What should I say in response? Arguing back might just escalate things. First, I try to calm down and think rationally. Well, now that I have some free time, maybe I should look for a job. Hey, I'm telling you, you better not be thinking about doing some part-time job around here. It's embarrassing for a wife from a wealthy family to be seen working part-time in the neighborhood. Indeed, as Jennifer said, Paul started acting all high and mighty as soon as his mother passed away. It's clear he wants to assert that he is superior to those around him. It really does seem like men start believing they're the top dog once their parents are gone. If part-time work is out of the question, maybe I should consider full-time employment. But then, the thought of finding full-time work after 22 years of not working fills me with anxiety. Without me saying anything back, Paul started yelling. To start with, I was never interested in women, so I didn't want to get married. But my mother insisted. Now that she's gone, I see no need for a wife. What? Even the arranged marriage was just for appearances. Considering I was to be the next company president. Paul kept going, taking advantage of my silence to say whatever he wanted. This might be beyond just acting superior. As I thought about my future with Paul, I felt anxious and asked. So, what? You want me to leave? No, I didn't say that. Well, I'll be gone on a business trip for a week starting tomorrow. Use that time to think about what you can do. Why does Paul only know how to speak so arrogantly? I figured it was useless to say anything more to him and simply responded, okay. During Paul's week-long business trip, I was consumed with unease. I even thought about divorcing and going back to my mother's place. But, lacking confidence in my ability to live on my own after a divorce, I hesitated. My mother raised me single-handedly, and the last thing I wanted was to burden her now. Just then, my phone rang. Seeing it was a call from my mother, I immediately answered. Wendy, it's been a while. How have you been?
Yeah,
I'm fine. Hearing my mother's voice after such a long time brought a bit of joy to my heart. She's been working hard in a place far away, unable to visit easily. That's why she couldn't attend my mother-in-law's funeral. My mother and mother-in-law were old friends, and she felt guilty for not being able to attend. But she mentioned she would be returning home soon as her work had settled. Thinking about meeting my mother soon filled me with happiness. I can't wait to see you, Mom. I'm looking forward to it. Yes, dear. And when I do, we'll have to properly apologize at your mother-in-law's altar for missing the funeral. I really regret not being able to attend. My mother felt so deeply about my mother-in-law for good reasons. I decided to look forward to the day of her return. Even after ending the call, my spirits remained high. Then, Paul returned from his business trip. It was well past midnight, much later than expected. Paul came home drunk, staggering around. Hey, I'm home now. As soon as he said that, he fell at the entrance without taking off his shoes and fell asleep right there. I had no choice but to remove his shoes and carry him to the bedroom, resting his arm over my shoulder. While carrying him, his wallet fell out of his pocket, so after I had settled Paul, I picked it up. The wallet was open, and its contents, including bills and cards, were scattered about. As I gathered them to put back into the wallet, I noticed a small-sized photo taken by an instant camera inside. It showed Paul, a woman around 30, and a small boy, all looking happy together, almost like a family photo. Tucked behind this photo was a small, folded piece of paper that caught my attention. When I opened it, it turned out to be a divorce application, already filled out with Paul's name. Meaning he wants to divorce me, possibly to remarry this woman. I tried to wake Paul by shaking his shoulder. Paul, wake up for a moment. Paul barely opened his eyes and started mumbling in his sleep. Wendy. Make sure you put away all my stuff. Put away? What do you mean? Was he talking about his luggage from the business trip? But there shouldn't be that much to put away, considering clothes can be cleaned at the hotel on business trips. Maybe he's thinking of moving out after the divorce. But that would make me the head of the household. This house has been passed down through the Morrison family, so I can't decide on my own about its matters. Thinking this, I decided to call Tony and his wife, the closest relatives, the next morning. It was a Sunday, so Tony was at home, but Jennifer answered the phone. Oh, Jennifer, sorry for calling so early in the morning. There's something I need to discuss while Paul is still asleep. No problem, I'm up early anyway. But it sounds like something's up. I explained about the photo and divorce application I found in Paul's wallet, and how he told me to put away all his stuff. Jennifer discussed it with Tony, who was next to her, trying to think of a good idea. Then, I heard Tony's voice in the background. A week-long business trip? That comment from Tony, sounding puzzled, made me question too. Jennifer, could you put Tony on the phone, please? After I asked, Tony immediately came on the line. Hello. A week-long business trip for the president, what's that about? Well, Paul often says he's going on long business trips. And he's away from home for a week at times. There's never been any week-long business trip for the president. At most, it's been a night or two. Tony's words struck a chord with me. A fake long-term business trip, and a photo with an unknown woman and what looks like her child. When I shared this, Tony seemed to have a suspicion and asked, "Is that photo with you right now, Wendy?" "Yes, I have it, but could you take a picture of it with your smartphone and send it to either Jennifer or me?" Following his request, I quickly took a photo of the picture with my smartphone and emailed it to Jennifer. After seeing the image, Tony informed me. "This woman, it's Amy Brown from our company." I thought so. "What's going on, Tony?" Tony sounded a bit uneasy as he replied. "Well, actually, this Amy was working as our office clerk until 2 years ago." Tony mentioned that this Amy, a former clerk, was rumored to be having an affair with Paul, the president, within the company. She left the company 2 years ago, and at that time, some employees speculated she might have been pregnant. If the child in the photo was born around that time, their age would match. If this story is true, Paul is likely the father of the child. Was Paul pretending to be on long business trips to visit this child and his wife? Thinking it might be easier for women to discuss, Tony handed the phone back to Jennifer. "Wendy, are you okay? Keep yourself together. I've thought of something that might help." Jennifer then advised me on what to do next. Considering the house-related issues after consulting with Tony, Jennifer and I have always been able to discuss anything, which made it easier to talk about this situation. "Thank you, Jennifer. Paul will be gone for a week starting the day after tomorrow, pretending to be on a business trip. I'll use that time to act on your suggestion." Indeed, Paul was leaving under the pretense of a long business trip for a week. This timing was perfect for me, because my mother is returning in 3 days. I informed my mother about Paul's situation and Jennifer's suggestion via email. The next day, I prepared for Paul's business trip. Seeing this, Paul commented, seemingly impressed. "Oh, look at you. If only you could always manage things this well without being told." Paul, perhaps because he was drunk that night, didn't remember what he had said. "Oh, I forgot to mention, my mother is coming back the day after tomorrow. You'll be on your business trip, so you won't see her, but I'll say hi for you." "Really? Your mother, who's been working far away, is coming back. She attended our wedding in such poor-looking clothes, making it obvious she's from a poor family." Paul always ridiculed my mother like this. Not that she was working overseas out of necessity, but he presumed we were from a poor family just because I came from a single-parent household. Rather than correct him, I let it go. The next morning, Paul left the house. Immediately after, I started acting on Jennifer's suggestion. The day after, my mother arrived at our house before noon. Jennifer also came over, wanting to meet my mother, and the 3 of us decided to go out for a meal. My mother, busy with work, could only afford to spend the day with us before returning. "I read your email. It must have been rough. But look at this, the house is all tidied up." "Yes, so I'm sorry. Since you just got back, we have nothing at home and have to eat out. By the way, did you arrange my part?" "Yes, everything's set. It was all so sudden, I couldn't arrange for us to go together. But I'm always ready for you." My mother said this as she handed me a plane ticket. "That's wonderful, Wendy. Everything seems to be falling into place." I can't wait to see how Paul reacts when he returns. Yes, thanks to you, Jennifer. I wouldn't know what to do on my own. I felt truly grateful to have Jennifer, a strong ally, by my side. And it was fortunate that my mother returned just at the right time. Over the next 4 days, I swiftly made all the arrangements and submitted the divorce application. Then, I left on a plane with the ticket my mother gave me. Early in the morning, I noticed dozens of missed calls on my smartphone. As expected, they were from Paul. Anticipating another call, it didn't take long before Paul called again. Hey. Why didn't you answer your phone? Because I just woke up. What? It's past noon? Paul said that, but where I am now, it's early morning. Well, that doesn't matter. What does matter is that when I got home, it was empty. Where did you take all my stuff? Oh? Didn't you say it yourself? Make sure you put away all my stuff. So, I threw it all away. What? When did I ever ask for that? It seems Paul, likely due to his drunken state at the time, genuinely doesn't remember. Paul pressed further with his questions. Also, the car seems to be missing. Are you driving it? And where are you right now? I'm in France, at my mother's house. There was a moment of silence on Paul's end after my response, as if he was at a loss for words. Since he didn't say anything back, I continued the conversation. Oh, about the car, I sold it before moving. And the house has been sold as well, so you'll need to move out soon. What? Wait a minute. First off, your mom being in France has got to be a lie, right? No point in lying, just come back home now. Paul is oblivious to the fact that my mother has successfully managed an apparel brand in France. And about the poor-looking clothes my mother wore to our wedding. She designed them herself for her brand. To Paul, unfamiliar with brands, they probably looked plain. Looking back, Paul never involved himself in discussions between our families before our marriage. He simply assumed my mother was overseas working hard based on his misconceptions. My mother-in-law was a regular customer at my mother's shop in the US. Thus, my mother and mother-in-law knew each other well. And I've known my mother-in-law since I was a child. After I explained all this, Paul suddenly burst into loud laughter. Are you kidding me? I get it about your mom. But this house has been passed down in my side of the family. I'm the head of this house now, there's no way you could have sold it without my consent. Hearing this, I sighed, realizing he still hadn't grasped the situation. Sigh. As expected, you weren't aware of something so important. Huh? What are you talking about? My mother-in-law left a notarized will, entrusting the house and land to me after years of my caregiving, acknowledging my efforts. She knew that although Paul took over his father's company, he was unreliable as a president, leaving all the crucial tasks to Tony, the executive vice president. Moreover, Paul, who did nothing at home, even let me handle all car purchases since they were all registered under my name. Paul hasn't fulfilled his role in both family and company matters. Therefore, my mother-in-law entrusted everything to me, concerned about my future without her. Tony and Jennifer agreed to this during a family meeting, which Paul attended but didn't pay attention to, hence his ignorance. That's the situation. Also, your fake long business trips are already known by the company. You were visiting that woman Amy, weren't you? Paul gasped when I mentioned Amy's name. I continued, almost delivering the final blow. Amy's child is yours, right? There were plenty of rumors about your affair with her in the company. Tony is checking the retirement list now. You know, companies are legally required to keep employee records for 3 years. Paul didn't try to rebut. He's likely left everything to Tony. Given Tony's nature, he would directly investigate Amy's situation and uncover the truth. Paul, seemingly resigned, muttered softly. Just come back once, please. I've been thinking we should really talk. After all, we're married. Oh? We're not married anymore. That divorce application you brought back from your fake business trip? I signed it and filed it. Upon hearing about the divorce application, Paul exclaimed in shock with a loud, "What? Why did you do that?" That was just to reassure Amy because she kept asking when we would get divorced. I never intended to divorce you. Despite having a child with another woman, Paul did not want a divorce. Likely, he was concerned about public perception, trying to maintain the facade of a marriage with me while also caring for Amy. However, I was no longer willing to be manipulated by such thoughts. For now, there are still things to do regarding the house sale, not to mention the division of assets. So, I will be returning to the US. We can talk more then. After saying that, I ended the call. A month later, I returned to Japan to handle various procedures. Since the house was no longer available, we decided to meet at Tony's place. Paul, as well as Amy and her son Keith, were there. Paul was apparently living with Amy now. Amy, holding Katie, looked at me fearfully. I never intended to take your husband. Paul forced himself on me, and now, I'm just trying to raise our child. If you demand compensation, I can't afford it. Amy seemed like a timid woman, already defending her position before hearing anything from me. You don't need to be so scared. I won't demand compensation from you. Paul will be the one paying. As I pointed at Paul while saying this, he looked shocked. Isn't that the same thing? Taking money from me would just make life harder for Amy and Keith. It turned out that a paternity test confirmed Keith was indeed Paul's child. Well, that's the consequence of cheating. Now, you two will have to do your best. It seems like Paul will need to start looking for a job. My words left Paul and Amy speechless. The affair and resulting child, leading to our divorce, had become widely known within the company. A meeting was held without Paul's knowledge, leading to his resignation and Tony being appointed as the new president. Jennifer kept me updated on these developments. When I shared all this with Paul, Tony placed a hand on Paul's shoulder. That's the situation. So, you will be resigning at the end of this month, President. Paul was left speechless, and next to him, Amy, holding Keith, started crying. It was unfortunate for Keith, but his parents, Paul and Amy, needed to support him going forward. Sometime later, I received an email from Paul. He had lost his job, and Amy was supporting them with part-time work. Yet Paul did no childcare at all. Unable to bear it any longer, Amy left their son, Keith, with her parents. Once alone, Paul, who could say whatever he wanted, began verbally abusing Amy. Predictably, speaking harshly to such a meek woman had clear outcomes. Crying, Amy returned to her parents' home and never came back. As a result, Paul fell into poverty and, not knowing what to do, sent me an email. Ignoring his email, I then received a call from him. "Wendy, why are you ignoring me? It's all because you threw everything away that I ended up like this. I've got no money, no job. What am I supposed to do now?" Although I received compensation, the division of property from selling our house and land should have been substantial. Likely, Paul, having no sense of money management, squandered it all. Facing Paul's selfish complaints, I retorted as if to match his words with mine. "What are you, always playing the victim? I could have been married to someone better if not for being stuck with you. Chosen only for appearances. How are you going to make up for ruining my life?" Of course, I didn't think that way at all. But Paul, taking it seriously, seemed at a loss for words and ended the call with a frustrated "fine." Paul, showing no remorse for his actions in work or family life, is likely to continue struggling with finding employment and poverty. Despite me telling Paul he wasted my life, I actually believe no experience is truly wasted. Now, I'm living happily in France with my mother, studying French. I'm aiming to work in caregiving here, leveraging my 20 years of experience. France has many caregiving facilities, and though my mother is still vigorously working past 70, I plan to care for her when the time comes. However, when I mentioned this, my mother somewhat sulkily said, "I'm still fully active. I doubt I'll need caregiving while I'm alive." My strong-willed mother, living life on her terms, is both admirable and dear to me. She's always been a role model for me as a woman. Therefore, I plan to continue pursuing my dreams by her side.